Good evening, my name is Nigel Lapworth, and one of the stories in our anthology, one of mine, is The Devil's Game. The face in the driver's mirror stared back at Marcel. He wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The greying widow's peak hung further back on his forehead than it ever used to, and he couldn't dismiss the start of a double chin that somehow happened to all 40-somethings. He touched up the red face paint in the few areas he'd missed earlier and worried about his complexion. The once pinch-tight skin covered his high cheekbones had lost its olive glow and was beginning to look sallow and unhealthy beneath his disguise. He needed more exercise, he chastised himself quietly while he worked. He knew in his heart the impulse would only manifest itself as a vow to take more vitamins. He sighed and started to apply the horns, frowning hard to remove the wrinkles from his temples so that they'd stick properly. Finally satisfied, he took one last look, readjusted the mirror, got out of his car and began to thread his way through the clutter that littered the unseen areas of every carny. He approached the marquee they'd set up that morning and spotted Sandra busying herself at the front table, putting out the cash box and flyers. She changed her outfit again, he noticed. Leather this time, and a midriff too. Perfect for this event, he thought. She looked up and grinned. Looks like a nice day for it. He made a theatrical show of studying the sky. Looks like rain, he replied solemnly. They'd made the same feeble joke every time they'd worked together, but it still made them laugh. He went through to the back of the marquee to sort out the rest of the equipment. Yeah, what did you make of the chainsaw-throwing mutants in the dress rehearsal earlier? I thought one of them was going to really hurt himself, she observed salaciously. They look bloody scary to me, he admitted. Funny setup here though, isn't it? All these buildings and cranes, not like our normal showground gigs. The setup phased him for reasons he couldn't fathom. He tried to find the right words. I mean, don't you feel claustrophobic surrounded by office blocks? She shrugged non-committally as she started on the pin badges and mugs. I'm not convinced this is the right sort of event for the game, he went on lamely. It was too late to back out now though, and yet an indefinable worry still nagged. The event was more of a show than a fair, reflected Marcel as he set up the camping primus and filled the kettle with water. The organisers had rented a derelict office complex from some developers who weren't yet ready to send in the bulldozers, but didn't mind free security for a few days. They'd wandered around the main stage area during the dress rehearsal, set up on a paved courtyard in the middle of intimidating 5-storey grey-clad buildings, big enough to accommodate the usual plethora of side stalls sprawling onto the adjoining lawns. Some of the performers had climbed up the outside of the buildings and abseiled back down again dressed as orcs. Circus blogs had choreographed an aerial ballet with dancers suspended on bungee cords from cranes. Sandra was entranced and said she thought it looked like the X Factor meets Hieronymus Bosch. They'd watched fight scenes, bike stunts, pyrotechnics and fire eaters until Marcel had felt so giddy he'd made an excuse to retire to their marquee. The legendary urban myth was due to perform later, and the light show was arranged by an events club called Highlights, who were fast becoming renowned for the spectacular. Marcel thought the name sounded like a bunch of dodgy hairdressers, but they were certainly the business when they'd seen them in Cardiff last year. Cardiff, blimey, now there'd been a show. He'd taken the cape off when the temperature had hit the 90s, until the show director had complained. Whoever heard of the devil getting twat? He'd smirked in his broad Welsh brogue, the final T languishing forever. You try playing all day in this get-up and see how hot you get, Marcel had countered, but demurred rather than start a scene. Tee up, Sandra, he called out from the rear of the marquee. She placed an ancient-looking brown ledger reverently next to the cash box and stood back to admire the layout before accepting the proffered mug. Everybody had to sign the ledger before challenging the devil. That was the thing that gave the punters that extra thrill of excitement. It made the game seem that little bit more dangerous, Sandra said. Marcel sat in the shadows, waiting to make his entrance while Sandra hawked for punters. Good crowd building up, by the looks of it. Well, it is Friday, she called back before turning back to start working the crowds again. He studied her quietly, as he had so many times before. The money they raised was as much down to her ability to draw in the punters as it was his ability with a bat. How old was she really? 30 perhaps? It was hard to tell. He slept with her once. She joked with him that it would cost him his soul. He'd wanted to date her properly after that, despite, or possibly because of the shredded back that had half crippled him the following morning. She'd laughed him off with Teflon ease. His pride as well as his back had soon recovered, and he still found her attractive though, and assumed every other man did too, but he found it a dry, unfulfilling emotion. "Come on, you lucky people," she belted out above the thrum of revving motorcycles emanating from the direction of the main stage. "You could win a fantastic prize. What about you, sir?" Sandra called out to a sloppily dressed businessman type who was trying to find his way back to the beer tent. He came to a halt, eventually managing to focus somewhere between the top of her long leather skirt and her patterned bandana. Sandra's eyes glittered in the afternoon sunshine. At last, his gaze fixed contentedly on Sandra's bosom, as though it, at least, knew what it was about. He slopped the remaining beer in his mug with an exaggerated shrug, and agreed to give it a go. Marcel rolled his eyes and sighed as he picked up his bat, scowling and flaring his cape out dramatically behind him for full effect as he appeared from the tent's darkened interior. "Green bat or blue, Mr. Fotherington?" Sandra asked after a quick glance at the ledger. He picked his weapon of choice and she guided him to the game table. Marcel glanced once at his challenger, inhaled deeply and served a straight winner. He'd once been proud that he'd been captain of the team at Durham University before all that business with the homegrown weed and the dean's niece, but old memories faded like sepia photographs. These days he relied on the game's tricks to score 8 points before his opponent scored 4. Sometimes it was close, but never beyond his control. During the second point, the table tilted towards the challenger. The small crowd had gathered and howled with laughter as the unfortunate man struggled to come to terms with the new rules. "Your serve, Mr. F," called out Sandra, as the threatening buzz of mutant chainsaws erupted from the stage area. The salesman concentrated and managed a passable serve, but Marcel executed a winning smash using the new slant to his advantage. "Your soul will be mine," cried Marcel triumphantly, looking over at Sandra as he did so. She smiled back and licked her lips. On point 5, Marcel introduced the elliptical ball, with which, to everyone's surprise, his opponent managed to clip the net and score a point. But on point 9, it changed to a weighted ball. The salesman had all but given up by now, and, beaten on the very next point, wandered off in search of what was left of his dignity. The bystanders cheered, but Marcel didn't acknowledge them. He headed back into his gloomy corner, glancing briefly at the ledger on the way, as though it had glanced at him first. The afternoon wore on with its familiar pattern of public fantasy, loud music, lights, smells, and shimmying punters dazzled by the atmosphere. The aerial ballet got underway just as the clinging sun melted gently behind the buildings, to be overtaken almost immediately by a perfect summer evening. As daylight dimmed, the various attractions lit up their stalls, just as highlights flared up a synchronised overture of spots, backlights and washes. White-clad trumpeters appeared from the uppermost stories of the buildings to announce the start of the climactic ballet sequence with a fanfare. As the cranes hoisted the principal dancers into the air for the first time, the musicians serenaded them from on high like an angelic horde. On the ground, caches of saxophone players held above head height in digger scoops blared out a demonic counterpoint as the dancers began to weave their story of sin and redemption in the air between. Marcel became aware that a crowd of about a dozen youths, had gathered near the marquee, and while some of them were paying attention to the main feature in the near distance, others were regarding the marquee curiously. They were all the same to Sandra. "Who's got the balls then?" she goaded. "Come on, you lot! If you win, you could win this fantastic 28-inch flat screen." She gestured towards the main prize, which stood on a side table, unclaimed for over 2 years. They hesitated as though holding a collective breath. "I'll give it a go," called out a confident voice from among the sea of Adidas and Primark tops. The adolescent throng parted to allow one of their number through. The boy carried himself with a certain ease. A dude swagger threatened low-slung grey hipsters, and he threw back the hood of his jungle camouflaged fleece, grinning wickedly at Sandra as he strode forward. His open Mediterranean features reminded Marcel oddly of a reflection of his younger self. Sandra explained the rules and handed him a bat. Her natural exuberance unaccountably subdued. "What does SAL stand for?" she asked sceptically, as the boy signed the ledger. He shrugged. "Salvador, but everyone just calls me Sal." His voice carried a curious calm that was both energising and unnerving. Sandra squirmed but held her tongue. Sal readied himself for the devil's first serve. He held Marcel's eyes for a moment, searching. Then he smiled and took a deep breath. Marcel's serve was good enough to win the point after a short rally, but he was impressed. Sal could obviously play after a fashion. This time it was Sal to serve. As the rally began and the game became more intense, the crowd's reactions to the aerial ballet became distant like waves on a shingle beach. Marcel won the point and was surprised to see his opponent's entourage wander off, leaving the three of them alone. Sal won the point with a fine drop shot and fought well on the fourth before succumbing to a vicious smash from Marcel. "You played this before?" he asked Sal, as he easily mastered the elliptical ball, winning a freaky point against the table edge. "Oh yeah, but not necessarily to these rules." His smile was radiant, and Marcel found himself grinning back. Sandra fidgeted nervously. "Come on, Marcel," she goaded. "Show us what you're made of." Her encouraging smile was strained, and her constant fretting galvanised Marcel's efforts as he won the next 3 points comfortably, but he flunked service of the weighted ball, and Sal was able to capitalise to make the score 6-3. "Come on, big man," screamed Sandra. "Let's take this sucker." Pacing up and down at the edge of the table, she was agitated in a way Marcel hadn't witnessed before. It was only a game, for heaven's sake. He glanced across the table at Sal as he was preparing to serve, but the look on the boy's face overwhelmed him momentarily. It seemed a combination of some deep sadness mixed with agonised adoration. Not of him, he thought, but of life itself, the essence of love caught in the half-light. A moment later, the world re-entered. The crowd broke into tumultuous applause as the big dive sequence began to bring the ballet to its climax. Sal served. Both players were immersed in concentration as Sandra became even more frantic on the sidelines, unable to intervene. Her anguish dissipated momentarily as Marcel finally made the point good, but she looked like a different person to him now, one he scarcely recognised. Her suppressed rage was so palpable he found it intruding into his own thoughts. There was no reason for it, he didn't understand. Now the players readied themselves to face the final point together. Marcel served and simultaneously turned on the strobe light with his foot switch. In his mind, Sandra and Sal became synchronised in the strange light. They were everywhere, two of a kind, elemental, while he simply carried on playing. One minute, Sandra was at the edge of the table hurling obscenities. In the next, it was as though she wasn't there at all. Sal filled the void, but then he too disappeared to be replaced once again by Sandra's fury. Marcel felt as though he was playing both of them, carrying on through a surreal tumult while stubbornly waiting for his opportunity. And when the moment came, he knew instantly that he could win the point. It was there for him. In the flickering light, he could see his opponent off balance. He'd succumb to a well-placed smash. If he played it now, he would win. He had the choice. But he also knew he had to choose. In that fleeting fraction of a second, a moment in time that seemed hours and no time at all, Marcel made his choice. A guttural scream of anguish and frustration rent his consciousness, just as the last trick, the thunder flash, boomed out from under the table. Marcel's universe twisted through an invisible mirror and went blank. After interminable moments, his exhausted senses returned to him, and he found himself seated cross-legged on the ground, with the ancient brown ledger resting gently in his lap. An appreciative crowd nearby was applauding the end of the aerial ballet, oblivious to any drama that might have just taken place in the ping-pong tent. She had gone. He knew it without turning around to look. He would miss her. He opened the ledger at random and watched in disbelief as the list of names faded into nothingness, disappearing as though they had never been written. He turned quickly to the most recent page, in time to see the very last entry blink out of existence. Jesus Christ, he muttered, and looked up in time to see a familiar boy turn and wink at him before pulling up his jungle hood and disappearing into the crowd to find his friends.